Hello, and welcome to part 2 of The Landscape Speaks. My name is Mave Calvert, and I'm a member of the British Society of Dowsers. I'm also known as Mave Marian, the Sherwood Dowser, and that's because I live on the outskirts of the ancient and mysterious forest of Sherwood in the English Midlands, famous for its legends of Robin Hood, Maid Marian, and the Merry Men. In part 1, we spoke about various landscape pentagrams that I've found. And in this part, we're going to talk about some representations of the heavens on the landscape that I've found and how these fit in with other people's research on landscape zodiacs. And then we're going to talk about a few places where it appears that multiple alignments might cross in the landscape. In the third and final part, we'll talk about some dowsing experiments that I've done to see if there are any energies associated with these landscape geometries and how those energies might fit in with water, trees, and elementals in the landscape. So, let's get started. I mentioned in part 1 about all the books I'd come across about landscape pentagrams. Well, back in 2006, I was also interested in where people had found representations of the heavens on the landscape. And I read many books by people like Graham Hancock, Greg Rigby, Mark Vidler, Wayne Herschel, Robert Bauval, and Adrian Gilbert. And I found them really interesting. And I printed out lots of constellations and put them on my desk to see if I could find any representations of the constellations in the area where I lived. I had been searching for representations of the constellations on the landscape for quite some time, and I hadn't met with much success. However, one day I'd put some place marks on Google Earth of the places where I have lived: York, Selby, Doncaster, and now the area close to Creswell Crags and Welbeck Abbey. And I noticed that these were more or less in a north-south alignment, so I drew straight lines between them. I had also got some place marks turned on connected to the Knights Templars, the preceptories at Temple Newsome, Templehurst, and the former Templar port at Faxfleet, and also a few place marks associated with my family history, including Hull, Ilkley, and Otley. Why, I glanced across on my desk and noticed a printout of the constellation Cygnus the Swan, and when I glanced back at the screen, I realized I had found a representation of Cygnus the Swan on the landscape. The tail of the swan, the star Deneb, is represented by York Minster, the star Sadr by Templehurst, the former Knights Templar preceptory, the star Cygnus X1 by Doncaster Minster, and the star Albirio, which represents the beak of the swan. I couldn't quite make up my mind between the locations of Creswell Crags and Welbeck Abbey. However, shortly afterwards, I found out that there was going to be an astronomy evening held at Creswell Crags with the Lincolnshire astronomer Paul Money. And he set up his powerful telescope in the car park, and we all queued to look through it. And when it was my turn, I was amazed when he said that he had trained his telescope on the star Albirio, the very place that I thought this represented on the landscape. Not only that, he told me when I looked through the telescope I would actually see two stars, because Albirio is a double star. Problem solved. Two stars, two locations. And my life happens to be directed by synchronicity. and of course there were some here. The emblem of Selby Abbey just happens to be 3 swans. I lived in Doncaster in my late teens and early 20s, and I used to drink in a pub opposite Doncaster Minster, and it happened to be called the White Swan. Research into Welbeck Abbey showed that the maiden name of the then lady of the manor happened to be Swan. And in his book The Cygnus Mystery, Andrew Collins talks about Creswell Crags and how a cave there has a panel of cave art in it that appears to represent the necks and heads of swans. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. When I mentioned the landscape Cygnus to the Templar mechanics chap, he was very interested, especially when I told him that it centred around Templehurst, and he said he'd been contemplating Templehurst for some time. So he had a look, and he indeed found some of his 5.151 geometry around that area. And you can find more about this on the Templar Mechanics website. Here we are at Creswell Crags. It's a magnesian limestone gorge, oriented more or less east-west, and it now marks the border between Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. On either side are tall limestone cliffs permeated with caves, and it's thought that Creswell Crags also marks the southern extent of the ice sheets that once covered a large part of the British Isles. The caves on the right-hand cliff are said to have been used for human habitation because they face south and would have got the warmth of the sun, whereas the caves in the left-hand cliff are likely to have been used for ritual and religious worship purposes because they face the northern skies. Archaeologists have found evidence of human habitation in Robin Hood Cave, and also evidence of Ice Age animals in the gorge itself, whereas Church Hole Cave is the one where the Ice Age cave art has been found. In the large part of the cave near the entrance was found a bison etched into the wall, and further along the cave was the bird panel, which Andrew Collins believes depicts swan-like birds with long necks and heads craned to the heavens. In his book The Cygnus Mystery, Andrew Collins says, on entering Church Hole for the first time in 2005, I realised immediately that it is oriented north, and that from the interior of the cave, even with a floor level lower than in Paleolithic times, a small window of vision is created above the cliff face opposite. Subsequent calculations ably demonstrated that Deneb, then circumpolar at this latitude, would have been visible from the cave as it crossed the meridian on its lower transit at a date of 10,800 BC. And this date is also the date when it's now thought that the last ice age ended abruptly because of an impact of a meteor or fragments of a meteor in North America. Creswell Crags is visited by the feminine earth energy current that accompanies the equinox line. And in part 1, I spoke about how I think the equinox line was a pilgrimage path, and that the feminine current marks the path that the women and children would have taken. And it occurred to me that at times when the pregnant women were about to give birth, they would have needed to seek shelter, and the caves at Creswell Crags would be an ideal place to do this. In fact, in the Cygnus Mystery, Andrew Collins refers to the shape of Church Hole Cave as a birth canal-like tube. There's also another earth energy current passes through Creswell Crags, and this is one that I found accompanies the landscape Cygnus in a north to south direction. And at Creswell Crags, it enters the back of Robin Hood Cave, comes out of the front of Robin Hood Cave, passes across the small river that goes through the gorge, and enters the birth canal-like tube of Church Hole Cave. So it pierces Church Hole Cave with the beak of the swan. Or, if you want to take the terminology taken by Dan Green in his book The Murder of Mary Magdalene, Cygnus can also be seen as a dagger which pierced the womb of the pregnant Mary Magdalene. And in another of those wonderful synchronicities that seem to dominate my life, I noticed that on page 171 of the Cygnus Mystery, Andrew Collins had showed a representation of the Egyptian goddess Nut over the Milky Way and shown how Cygnus is on her thighs. When I was looking at the local map, trying to figure out the relative positions of Creswell Crags and Welbeck Abbey, I happened to notice that the waterways made up of the Great Lakes on the Welbeck estate, the river running through Carberton, which is also on Welbeck land, and the river running into the adjacent Clumber Park, which used to be owned by the Dukes of Newcastle. The waterways actually make up exactly the same shape as the Egyptian goddess Nut. And if you turn the map the other way up, you can actually see this. And the feet are at a bend in the lake at Clumber Park. And this bend only occurred a few decades ago due to mining subsidence, so this couldn't possibly have been engineered. In 2014, I wrote a second little article for the network of Lay Hunters magazine, again under the pseudonym Melina Rose, and this one was about the landscape Cygnus. If you listen to part one, you won't be surprised when I tell you that the landscape Cygnus just happens to link in to some of the Midlands pentagrams. If we take the Chatsworth pentagram that surrounds the Derbyshire Peak district, one of the 5 arrows within the pentagram just happens to be pointing right at Templehurst. And if we take the second pentagram that I found surrounding Lincoln, one of the arrows of that one just happens to be pointing at Doncaster Minster. A couple of years on, I realised that the landscape Cygnus is surrounded by its very own landscape pentagram. I found the northern tip of this up near Rosedale Abbey at a place I used to regularly frequent. It was a rest and relaxation retreat called the Orange Tree that was owned by my cousin. And my dowsing showed that a significant tree in the grounds there was actually the northern tip of this pentagram. The retreat's now been taken over, and it is now a yoga retreat, appropriately renamed The Tree. The western tip of this landscape pentagram falls near Skipperton, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The southwestern tip falls at Arbour Low, the stone circle in northern England, which also forms the centre of a gypsy zodiac that we'll also talk about in a little while. The southwestern tip is at the former Knights Templar Preceptory of Temple Brewer, which I spoke a little bit about in part 1, and the eastern tip falls in the North Sea. two of the lines intersect at Tickhill Castle, which is owned by the Duchy of Lancaster. I had plotted the western tip of the orange tree pentagram to be in fields just on the outskirts of Skipton. In 2015, I started to share this research with other dowsers, and a couple of years later, my friend Chris Tong and some of the Manchester dowsers went on a trip to Skipton, and they went into the fields to have a look at where I had plotted the tip of this pentagram. And very close by they found a cup-marked boulder, which is known as the Great Wood Lathe-stone. And they sent me a Google Earth plot of the lines of energy that they had found associated with this stone. And I was amazed to see that the four on the right-hand side were going almost in the same direction as the other four pentagram tips. It's the first time that I had considered that there could be any energy associated with these landscape pentagrams, and we're going to talk a lot more about this in part 3. And here we can see the relative size of the orange tree pentagram compared to the 3 middle lands pentagrams. And the landscape Cygnus seems to be flying southwards, its beak penetrating into Churchhole Cave at Creswell Crags on the equinox line. In part 1, I introduced you to the White Cannons pentagram, and you probably won't be surprised to find out there are links between that and the orange tree pentagram that surrounds the landscape Cygnus. If we draw a line from the eastern tip of the White Cannons pentagram through the northern tip, it extends to Great Wood Lathe-stone, which is the western tip of the orange tree pentagram. Then, if we draw a line from the western tip of the White Cannons pentagram through the northern tip, it extends to the eastern tip of the White Cannons pentagram. And a line drawn from the midpoint of the bottom line of the White Cannons pentagram all the way up through the northern tip extends all the way to Rosedale at the northern tip of the orange tree pentagram. I've said it before, you just couldn't make this up. The star Deneb on the landscape Cygnus is represented by York Minster, and in March 2022 I visited York with the Yorkshire-based Ridings Dowsers, and we walked the York Ley. The York Ley begins at the former Archbishop's Palace behind York Minster. It then goes through the Minster itself, 3 churches, Clifford's Tower, which is the remains of York Castle, the site of a Templar chapel on St George's Fields, and terminates at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss. I returned to York again by myself to do some dowsing, and I found that in the crypt of the Minster an earth energy dragon current emerges from one of the tombs, and it winds its way southwards along the York Ley. Back home, when I plotted this on Google Earth, I realised that the York Ley and the landscape Cygnus follow exactly the same path, and I found that this earth energy dragon current weaves its way around the body of the Swan in the landscape Cygnus, going through Selby, Templehurst, Doncaster, and all the way to Creswell Crags, where it penetrates both Robin Hood Cave and Churchhole Cave. And in June 2022, the Society of Ley Hunters published an article that I'd written about the Ridings Dowsers' adventures walking the York Ley in their newsletter, and I had called the article "The York Ley, a Line of Sights and a Line of Sight." I was interested to see where the line would go if I were to extend the landscape Cygnus southwards. First, it went through Newstead Abbey, which happens to be the southwestern tip of the Sherwood Forest pentagram that I spoke about in part 1. It then goes through Wollerton Hall near Nottingham, and a place called High Cross, where the Roman roads of Watling Street and the Fosse Way cross each other, and that we'll talk a little bit more about shortly. Further south it goes through Farnborough Hall, Banbury Cross, Blenheim Palace, and the Isle of Wight, a place called Tennyson Down. When I extended the landscape Cygnus even further south, I was amazed to see that after it had gone through France, it hit the coast of Spain at the place called Magdalena, which just happens to be the northeastern tip of the Iberian pentagram that I talked about in part 1. Extending this line even further takes us into Africa, and it ends up touching a node point of what is known as the Becker-Huygens grid. And if you want to know more about the Becker-Huygens grid and other planetary grids, a good book to have a look at is the little wooden book called Earth Grids, written by Hugh Newman. In the winter skies of the Northern Hemisphere, we can see what is known as the winter triangle. And in the summer skies of the Northern Hemisphere, we can see what is known as the summer triangle. The winter triangle is made up of the constellation Orion and his two mythological hunting dogs, Canis Major and Canis Minor. The summer triangle is made up of Cygnus the Swan, the constellation Aquila the Eagle, and the constellation Lyra the Harp. And I actually found representations of these mirrored on the English landscape. Like with the landscape Cygnus, I wasn't actually looking for them, but I had images of them printed out on my desk. And at the time, I was taking the yellow belly pentagram and extending the various lines to see if it went to any interesting places, which indeed it did. And the interesting places included Whitby Abbey up in North Yorkshire, Pendle Hill that we talked about in part 1 when we mentioned the Druids' Temple pentagram, also Glastonbury Abbey and Bury St Edmunds Abbey, the latter two being on the St Michael alignment. And when I drew in the St Michael alignment, I realised that the triangle formed by Lincoln, Glastonbury and Bury St Edmunds looked quite similar to the shape of the triangle that the summer triangle makes up. And I drew in a line from Whitby Abbey to Pendle Hill and realised that this looks very much like the shape of the winter triangle. And this is what transpired. I had both the winter triangle and the summer triangle superimposed on the English landscape, with the pivot point being Lincoln. So here we have the dark triangle and the light triangle. The winter triangle that is seen in the northern skies is represented on the landscape of northern England. It's made up of Whitby Abbey, which represents the star Betelgeuse in the constellation Orion. And Whitby Abbey is famous for the novels of Dracula by Bram Stoker. Pendle Hill in Lancashire is famous for the Pendle witch trials, and that represents the star Procyon in the constellation Canis Minor. And Lincoln Cathedral represents Sirius in the constellation Canis Major. And then we have the light triangle, the summer triangle that can be seen in the summer skies in the south in the northern hemisphere, and that is on the southern landscape of England. And it's represented by Glastonbury Abbey, which is Altair in Aquila the Eagle, Bury St Edmunds Abbey, which is Vega in Lyra the Harp, and again we have Lincoln Cathedral, this time representing the star Deneb in the constellation Cygnus the Swan that we've been talking about in relation to the landscape Cygnus. And it's very interesting that Lincoln Cathedral appears to be the pivot point between the two triangles, because both Sirius and Deneb feature in Dan Green's Lincoln Da Vinci Code. And this is essentially a Freemasonic vision quest, which leads the initiate around the environs of Lincoln Cathedral, decoding various clues and ending up at the site of a former Templar church close to the cathedral. And Dan Green tells us that in the 1990s, the then Dean of Lincoln Cathedral wanted it to be closed for 3 months for exorcism because he thought it was a battleground between light and dark. And in the recent book called The Emerald Modem by Richard Leviton, he also alludes to a battle between light and dark taking place there. And Lincoln Cathedral has 2 rose windows. One faces north and one faces south. And the north-facing window is thought to be a giant star map. Now, when we bring together dark and light, we don't necessarily have to have a battle. We can get the yin-yang symbol, where dark and light come together in perfect harmony. And perhaps this is the true role of the pivot point that Lincoln Cathedral represents. And here we can see the 2 triangles on Google Earth. Also the equinox line and the 3 middle lands pentagrams that it bisects. And we also have the landscape Cygnus flying south into the Sherwood Forest pentagram, where it hits the equinox line at Creswell Crags and pokes its beak into Churchhole Cave. And as we said earlier, the line between Glastonbury and Bury St Edmunds is part of the St Michael alignment. The line between Glastonbury and Lincoln pretty much follows the course of the Fosse Way. And you can see here that Lincoln, being the centre of the yellow belly pentagram and also centre of the 2 triangles, is rather strategically placed. And here we see a close-up of the yellow belly pentagram that surrounds Lincoln, which I mentioned in part 1. And we can see how the winter and summer triangles are actually aligned with the yellow belly pentagram. The winter triangle line that goes from Lincoln Cathedral to Whitby Abbey goes true north right up Ermine Street and through the tip of the yellow belly pentagram at Caneby Corner. We then find in the summer triangle the line from Lincoln Cathedral to Bury St Edmunds Abbey goes right through the southeast tip of the yellow belly pentagram, and the line from Lincoln Cathedral to Glastonbury Abbey goes right through the southwest tip of the yellow belly pentagram. We can find not 1 but 2 representations of the constellation Cygnus in the landscape around Lincoln. The first, on the left, is made up of the city centre itself. The body of the swan is the old Roman road Ermine Street, and the wings of the swan are represented by the waters in Lincoln, the River Witham and the Fosse Dyke. And the star Cygnus X1 is represented by what used to be Lincoln's second cathedral, known as St. Catherine's Cathedral, because it was the remains of St. Catherine's Priory and was for a while the seat of an Anglican bishop. Lincoln Cathedral itself is up at the top opposite Lincoln Castle, with Ermine Street flowing straight down between the two. On the right, we see the second representation of Cygnus in the landscape around Lincoln. Again, the body of the swan is made up by Ermine Street, now the A15, and this time the wings are represented by the roads that go between Gainsborough All Saints, Caneby Corner, and Walesby All Saints. The tail of the swan, Deneb, is Redbourne Mere, and the beak of the swan, Albirio, is Lincoln Cathedral itself. And if we look at the yellow belly pentagram, we can see that this second landscape Cygnus sits perfectly on top of it, and it looks for all the world like Cygnus is flying straight into Lincoln Cathedral, which it pierces with its beak. The constellation Cygnus can also be seen as a dagger, and it's rather interesting that in Dan Green's book, The Murder of Mary Magdalene, he suggests that Mary Magdalene was murdered by having a dagger thrust into her pregnant womb, and that her relics now rest underneath Lincoln Cathedral, having been brought there by the Templars. And here we see a representation of a dagger piercing the womb of Lincoln Cathedral. In 2010, I went to Bury St Edmunds, where I attended a really interesting conference called The Stars and Stones. A presentation was given there by a chap called Anthony Thorley, who was part of the Gatekeeper Trust, and he spoke about a landscape zodiac called the Gypsy Switch, and apparently it was the route traversed by Irish travellers around England and Wales, and it was divided into 12 segments, each representing a sign of the zodiac, and the travellers would go to that particular part of the country when the sun was in that particular zodiacal sign. The centre or hub of this wheel is the Arborough Stone Circle in the Derbyshire Peak District, which marks the southwestern tip of the orange tree pentagram. It's also just south of the equinox line, and it's visited by the masculine earth energy current that accompanies the equinox line. A little to the north, on the other side of the equinox line, is Arborow's sister henge, Bullring Henge, and that is visited by the feminine current that accompanies the equinox line. And if indeed the equinox line was a pilgrimage path, it's possible that the men and older boys visited Arborough when the women and children were at Bullring Henge. And I've been to both sites several times with other dowsers, and the feeling is that there is a processional connection between the two. So it's possible that the men and boys processed from Arborough to meet with their women at Bullring Henge. Now, a lady called Jill Smith and some companions actually decided to spend a year walking the Gypsy Switch in the mid-1980s. And they started off in Lincoln and intended to spend a month in each of the zodiacal constellations at the same time of the year as the sun was in that constellation. And this shows that the equinox line marks the centre of the Gypsy Switch, and it also shows that Jill Smith and her companions started their pilgrimage at the autumn equinox of 1984 in Lincoln. They then went through the southern constellations, ending up at the other end of the equinox line at Anglesey at the spring equinox of March 1985. Some of her companions dropped out, but Jill Smith and her newborn baby managed to complete the entire gypsy switch, ending up back in Lincoln 6 months later. And here we have yet another landscape zodiac. This one is known as the British Zodiac, and it was found by Peter Dawkins, who is a founder member of the Gatekeeper Trust. And it covers more or less the same area as the Gypsy Switch, but instead of centering on Arbour Low, it centres upon the place called High Cross, where the roads of the Fosse Way and Watling Street cross. And if you remember, when we extended the landscape Cygnus southwards, it also passes through High Cross. And here I've superimposed the winter and summer triangles onto the British zodiac. And we can see that the line from Lincoln to Glastonbury, which more or less follows the course of the Fosse Way, passes right through High Cross. And if we now zoom in and superimpose the landscape Cygnus on this British zodiac, we can see how it seems that the swan is flying right towards High Cross. You may recall that in part 1 I said that Dan Green tells us that the constellation Cygnus the Swan can also be seen as a dagger, where its tip is the beak of the swan in the south. And Dan Green also suggested that Mary Magdalene was murdered by having a dagger thrust into her pregnant womb, and that her relics are now secreted beneath Lincoln Cathedral. And if we look at Cygnus being the dagger, we can see on the zodiac it's actually piercing the womb of the Great Bear, which is also known as the Plough or the constellation Ursa Major, just like the dagger is said to have pierced the womb of Mary Magdalene. Here is a plan of Churchhole Cave at Creswell Crags, and it's Churchhole Cave that the beak of the swan, or perhaps the tip of the dagger, pierces at Creswell Crags. At the top of the plan, you can see the wide entrance to the cave from the gorge, and that's where the cave art of the bison can be found. And then you can see reaching back what Andrew Collins calls the birth canal-like tube, and at the end of which can be found the bird panel with the cave art showing birds with long necks and beaks, their heads craned to the skies. The researcher Andis Collins, in his book Stars, Stones and Scholars, has equated the caves at Creswell Crags with the different constellations, and he has equated Churchhole Cave with the constellation Ursa Major, which just happens to be the same as the Great Bear and the Plough. While we're on the subject of the constellation Ursa Major, let's take a trip to northern France. In the mid-1990s, the researcher Greg Rigby from Sherwood Forest published a book called On Earth as It Is in Heaven, and he had found a representation of the constellation Ursa Major on the French landscape made up by cathedrals, and he'd also found a landscape pentagram connected to that constellation, as you can see in the diagram top left. I've plotted these on Google Earth in red, and Greg Rigby says in his book that if you take the line between the western and southwestern tips of his pentagram, it extends to Rennes-le-Château in southeastern France, the place that started my interest in all this all those many years ago. More recently, a book has been published by Corhan Moll and Christopher Morford entitled The Jerusalem Files, and that talks about a pentagram made up of cathedrals in northern France, and these cathedrals are all associated with labyrinths. So I plotted that on Google Earth in blue, and I decided, following Greg Rigby's lead, I would extend the line that connects the southwest and the western tips of this particular pentagram. And I extended it northwards, and it hit Lincoln Cathedral, which I found really interesting because the second booklet that Dan Green published about his Lincoln Da Vinci Code spoke about how the Lincoln Da Vinci Code is entangled with none other than Rennes-le-Château. As well as finding all these other landscape geometries, I also kept coming across places where it appeared that multiple alignments cross. These included Annesley Old Church and Micklebarrow Hill in Nottinghamshire, where I found 21 alignments and 32 alignments appearing to cross. Then at Bolsterstone Church near Sheffield, 15 alignments appeared to cross. At Cadwell Park in Lincolnshire, 23 alignments. 18 at Snaefell Mountain on the Isle of Man, and a further 10 at Moster Dome in Malta. The first time I found multiple alignments appearing to cross somewhere was in 2008, and this was at Micklebarrow Hill, which is not far from the southeastern tip of the Sherwood Forest pentagram which falls at Southwell Minster. I had got the Ordnance Survey map and encircled all the churches in the area, and had also used a highlighter pen to mark other significant places, such as mounds. And as I drew lines between different churches, I started to notice that many of these lines crossed over at one of the mounds, and this mound was Micklebarrow Hill. And when I drew these alignments on Google Earth, this is what it looked like. I was fascinated by the name Micklebarrow Hill because barrow implies an ancient mound, whereas Mickle could allude to St. Michael or the Archangel Michael. And as we saw in part 1, there is an alignment in southern England known as the St. Michael line, and that connects many hills and mounds that are dedicated to St. Michael. And we're going to talk a lot more about the possible significance of this in part 3. Two more places where multiple alignments appeared to cross were Cadwell Park in Lincolnshire and Annesley Old Church in Nottinghamshire. Cadwell Park is where there used to be a stately home, and it's in undulating woodland, and that's now been converted into a motor racing circuit. And I found 23 alignments appearing to cross there. Annesley Old Church is a couple of miles from the southwest tip of the Sherwood Forest pentagram, and here I found 21 alignments appearing to cross. Over St Mary's Church at Bolsterstone near Sheffield I found 15 alignments appearing to cross, and over Pendle Hill in Lancashire, which we spoke about in association with the Winter Triangle and also the Druids Temple pentagram, I found 13 alignments appearing to cross. In the Isle of Man, I found 18 alignments appearing to cross over Snae Fell, which is the highest mountain on the Isle of Man. And then in Malta, 10 alignments appeared to cross over the Moster Dome, which is a church built over the ruins of one of Malta's ancient temples. In part 1, I discussed how the Isle of Man is seen as the Omphalos of the British Isles, and I showed a landscape pentagram that I'd found there in the south of the island. And it's the north of the island, where the mountain Snae Fell is, where all the multiple alignments cross. And something else that I found in the Isle of Man was something right in the bottom southwest corner called Meal Hill. On older Ordnance Survey maps, it's called a stone circle, but now it's referred to as a chambered cairn. And what it actually is a circle of burial chambers, probably quite unique. Mealy Hill is a megalithic site about halfway up a hill overlooking the Irish Sea, and it comprises 6 pairs of burial chambers arranged in a circle with a gap in the northwest. And each pair of burial chambers has a little stone-lined entrance passageway. And this is a photograph that I took of one of the pairs of burial chambers. As you can see, there is a burial chamber on the left and one in the right. And then there are a couple of small standing stones marking where the little entrance passageway reaches the pair of burial chambers. Seen from above, this is what the site looks like. And what I did was to extend each of the little entrance passageways from each of the pairs of burial chambers to see where they went. And it was rather interesting to note that one went to Scotland, one to England, one to Wales, one to Cornwall, one to Southern Ireland, and one to Northern Ireland, given that it's thought that the Isle of Man is the Omphalos of the British Isles. And this site seems to be rather unique. Here you can see on the right how the lines extend into the various parts of the British Isles. And I was rather interested to note the line that extends southwards, goes through Cornwall, hits the tip of Brittany and goes into Spain. And it extends right through the middle of the Iberian pentagram that we talked about in part 1 and hits the southern tip of the Iberian pentagram at Gibraltar. Again, all these things seem to link into one another. And that, my dowsing, lay hunting and questing friends, concludes part 2 of the Landscape Speaks. I do hope you've enjoyed it and that you'll join me for part 3, when we're going to be discussing some dowsing experiments that I did to find out what the potential significance of these landscape geometries might be and how it relates to Earth and cosmic energies, water, trees and elemental beings. See you in part 3.